All right, here's kind of the next question. Will Joe Biden actually let Jay Powell and the Fed really tighten Fed policy? Here to talk about that is Art Laffer, former Reagan economic advisor, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient, co-author of Taxes Have Consequences, an income tax history of the USA, my dear friend and mentor. So, Arthur, you've been to a few of these meetings, presidents and Fed chairs. I've been to a few. Biden says today in his op-ed piece that he's not going to meddle with the Fed. What do you think about that? Meddling with the Fed? Is such a thing possible?
I think he is going to meddle with the Fed. I mean, if you go back in history, Nixon said that the Fed caused his loss in 1960 to John F. Kennedy because they raised interest rates and caused a problem. If you go back, I was in the White House from 1970 to 1972. I remember going with John Ehrlichman over to Arthur Burns' office to give the instructions, lower interest rates, do it. As you know, Trump wanted to lower interest rates as well. Biden is no different than any of these other presidents. Once interest rates start rising and the economy starts responding, I think you're going to see Biden pushing for lower interest rates dramatically and asking Powell to stop tightening on monetary policy. It just makes all the sense in the world that a president would want to do that. But it makes no sense from the standpoint of economics, Larry.
Well, Art, I got to read you this. I mean, gee whiz. He says, first, the Federal Reserve has a primary responsibility to control inflation. Okay. Then he says, my predecessor demeaned the Fed, and past presidents have sought to influence its decisions inappropriately during periods of elevated inflation. I won't do this. That's what Biden says, Art. I won't do this.
I know. Let me just talk to you about what the Fed would have to do if it really did things correctly.
Yep.
Let's imagine they wanted to reduce the balance sheet of the Fed, and I'm going to use a hypothetical example of, let's imagine they've got $9 trillion worth of assets on the balance sheet, mostly government bonds or government securities in some way, shape, or form. If they reduce the balance sheet of the Fed by $3 trillion, which would be just taking it back a couple of years, that's all they do. They'd have to sell $3 trillion worth of bonds in the open market that they will not buy, and then they will use the proceeds to reduce the liabilities they have to member banks in the system. Now, what do you think let's say a 4-year bond is worth currently? Do you think it's really, you'd only pay a yield of 2.5% if that were the rate? No. No one would buy those bonds at a yield of 2.5% when we have 8% plus inflation. Germany just came in with 8.7%. You've got a producer price index at 11+%. No one would do that. What would happen is the price of those bonds would fall sharply. Interest rates would rise very sharply, maybe up to 7, 8, 9, 10%. They would rise up that way. And the economy would be a huge hit to the economy. Markets would drop. All of this would happen. It is the only way really to control inflation. It's what Paul Volcker did to get the inflation under control. But Biden would not allow that. I mean, he would fight that like mad. The slowdown in the economy would occur, and it would lead to a really long-term problem of a recession in the U.S. Now, if he doesn't do that, you're going to get inflation continuing on its peak, going higher and higher and higher, until finally you get to the situation we had in early January 1981, where we had inflation running 14, 15, 16%. The prime interest rate was 21.5% the day we took office. You've got effective reserve rates of 19+%. Those are the choices. He is caught on a sticky trap. If he pushes to get a little this way, he's going to get stuck, and he'll have to push back and further sticky. He is in a dilemma, Larry, that he just can't get out of easily. Then you're going to see them start to be panicked. They're going to start to look at blaming companies for it, blaming other people for it, blaming oil for it,
blaming the
Saudis, companies.
Blaming the
you
Fed.
Get wage and price controls selectively at first, but then you'll get much broader ones. You're going to see this administration pushing as hard as they can to do anything they can to stop this inflation. They're panicked.
All right, last one.
Just lastly, Larry, if I can, whenever politicians make decisions, when they're either panicked or drunk, the consequences are always unattractive.
I get that. Here's quickly, 2 parts. One, will Jay Powell be honest with Biden about the likely increase of interest rates that you've just described? Or, number 2, does Jay Powell himself know that there's going to be a huge increase in interest rates?
Let me just answer the latter one first, Larry, if I can. Jay Powell is a nice man, he's all that, but he doesn't have the education, the training, the experience of any of that to be a really gravitas Fed chairman. He doesn't really know. He's caught in the same sort of sticky trap that Biden is. I think he will ultimately try to go along with the administration and do what Biden and the people in the White House want him to do.
Yeah.
I mean, Yellen will tell him all these others, but this is a very inexperienced Fed, Larry, and at a very serious time in history when they need to be as nuanced and as strong and as capable as they can be, which is just not what they are.
All right. I suspect you're right about all the above. Art Laffer, thank you. We will talk soon about all this stuff. Thanks very much.
Larry, thank you very much.